welcome everyone. Good morning. We are here for another Fueling Collaboration panel discussion. Just want to give a quick introduction. So I'm Jen Bunty. I'm the Public Info Coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists based in South Carolina, but I cover the entire Appalachian region. And I'm just going to be opening up the series today and then closing it out, but I'm going to try and make a lot of room for a really wonderful discussion. The Fueling Collaboration series, if you haven't attended before, if you're not that familiar with it, is presented by the US Forest Service Northern and Southern Research Stations and a partnership of the Eastern Fire Science Exchanges under the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network. So we have my exchange, the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, the Oak Woodlands and Forest Fire Consortium, Southern Fire Exchange, and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. So we got all the consortia needs covered. Just as a quick acknowledgement to all of our planning team and our partners, these are all the people that have put this together with their contact information. If you have any questions or want to follow up with any of us after, we're all welcome to any of you reaching out. This team is incredible and it's been such a pleasure to work with them through the last 3 seasons. Just a couple things coming up. So today we're here for fire and wildlife. Next month we'll be covering prescribed burning and in the Eastern WUI, the Eastern Wildland Urban Interface. And then in March, we have rescheduled the fire and water discussion that was supposed to happen in December for March 16th. So if you were scheduled or if you were registered for that fire and water discussion in December, or if you weren't, go ahead and register for it coming up in March. You don't have to re-register if you were registered in December. We'll send you the same information. All right, but getting down to it, we're here to talk about fire and wildlife. I have to give photo credit to the incredible Jack McGowan-Stinsky for this great little critter photo. A couple ground rules before we get started, before I kick it over to our moderator. Closed captioning is available and there'll be instructions put into the chat for how you can access that. This has been approved for 1.5 continuing ed credits through the Society of American Foresters. So if you're interested in that, you can go into your SAF profile, and I believe they'll be there after we send the attendee list to them. All attendees are going to be muted during this discussion. We invite you to utilize the chat. Usually in Fueling Collaboration discussions, the chat is, you can't avoid fire puns. It's on fire. It's usually going crazy, sharing resources, asking questions. Please feel free to do that, but keep yourselves muted and keep your cameras off. We also have a team behind the scenes that'll be sharing resources and pulling questions for our moderator. We've asked people to submit questions ahead of time when they registered, and we'll be addressing those first, but we've saved a little time at the end to answer some questions that come in through the chat. So please feel free to put them in there. Let's see, what else? This is recorded, and recordings will be made available on the Fueling Collaboration website, as well as on the CAFM's YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for those, and we'll be sending links to the mailing list as they're available. Last but not least, please be respectful, and please, this is an inclusive environment, so please be inclusive of differing opinions. We're all scientists and managers. Most of us are professionals in this atmosphere, so let's try and act that way, and we'll keep the chat going, and usually it can be a great discussion. And finally, we do have a survey available. The link will be put into the chat throughout the discussion and at the end. So please take a minute and tell us what you think, what you've learned. It really helps us for our reporting needs and also for developing further discussions and meeting your needs as our audience. All of these things all of your answers are anonymous, and it's not used for any sort of analysis. It's just used for our feedback. With that, I don't think I've missed anything. So Lauren, I'm going to kick it over to you to go ahead and start the discussion.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks for the introduction. All right, so my name is Lauren Pyle-Knapp. I'm a research ecologist with the Northern Research Station, and I'm located in Columbia, Missouri. I'm a plant and tree person, and so it's great to be able to facilitate this amazing panel. Let's get started. I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order by first name. And so I'm asking each panelist to introduce themselves and then provide a little tidbit about something we might not know about or something interesting. And so Susan, I saw just act a little surprised about that, but you go first.
I forgot to prepare that part of it. I'm sorry. I'm Susan Loeb. I am a research ecologist with the US Forest Service, the Southern Research Station. I'm located in Clemson, South Carolina. And for the past 20 some odd years, I have been working on bats, and a lot of that has been bats and fire. And a tidbit I need to come up with, I'll come up with it later.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, Paul.
Good morning, folks. I'm Paul Charland. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm stationed in East Lansing, Michigan. And I'm definitely on the implementation or management side. I'm a burn boss and been working on fire since 2000. And my tidbit is going to be that I'm going to plan to provide the most disappointing answers because I'm going to say it depends a whole lot.
Thanks, Paul. Marcus.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming and for having me here. I am a professor at the University of Florida in the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Program. I work extensively with a variety of wildlife species and their interactions with disturbances, especially fire, and I have a focus of a lot of that work on game species and work a lot with private landowners in the southeastern region in particular on managing habitat for game and other wildlife species with fire. As for the tidbit, I kind of went a little different way with it, and I've had a line of research in the last, I'd say we're coming up on a decade now, that really stemmed from one interaction with wildlife, and it was a turkey. And I actually implemented a prescribed fire treatment for an experiment on a place that was in a landscape where the turkeys had never seen fire in their lifetime, probably for multiple generations. And we implemented a treatment and then put cameras in there to monitor it. And we burned the day of, and I went back for mop up that evening, and a turkey had roosted in the smoke. And it really resonated with me that even though the turkey didn't have any reason to know what that was, it instinctually still colonized that burned area immediately after fire. And we had not seen turkeys in that particular location for several months. So it really resonated with me.
Good story, Marcus. Jim, your turn.
Morning, everyone. I'm Jim Cox. I work at Tall Timbers Research Station in North Florida. We're immersed in this wonderful landscape of about 250,000 acres of private properties where fire is the #1 issue each and every year for the landowners. Most of these properties are burning every year or every other year. And so we really get to see some of the wonderful southern pinelands that you can see in photographs, with the well-maintained overstory and the grasses below. My tidbit, I've come to this job in a very circuitous manner. I first began actually in music. I graduated undergraduate with English and history majors, and then somehow ended up in biology, and got out of graduate school with biology. So I've taken a lot of different routes, but I really love working with birds and enjoy especially studying the effects of fire.
So playing the penny whistle might be a real thing for you. Jim offered to play the penny whistle in case we had any technical difficulties. All right, Ashley, your turn.
Good morning, everyone. Ashley Peters. I most recently was with the Ruffed Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society. In the last couple of weeks, I've started a position with the University of Minnesota at their Institute on the Environment. But most of what I'll be talking about today is in relation to especially the last couple of years that I was with the Ruffed Grouse Society. I'm based out of Minnesota. I have 15 years of experience with communications and engagement in conservation. And really, I started in the field with BLM and Forest Service through AmeriCorps programs and Conservation Corps programs. That got me started, and then worked for the Minnesota DNR and the Audubon Society before the Ruffed Grouse Society. So I've had a pretty good spread of understanding all different types of user groups in the outdoors, and understanding their perceptions of wildfire and prescribed burns. So the interesting tidbit that I'll start off with here is just to mention that a lot of people don't know that ruffed grouse are endangered in Indiana. And there are several other states where we're worried about them being extirpated. So it's just one of those things that people think ruffed grouse are so common, but there are a lot of states where we're seeing a real steep decline in their populations.
Thanks, Ashley. Bringing it back to you, Susan, to give you a chance to talk. Or we don't have to. I can move on. Okay. All right. So we had over 700 people register for this panel discussion. This really points to the interest in wildlife and fire and people's concern about burning with wildlife. So when you registered, you were able to put in questions. We were able to sort of bring those questions together, synthesize them, and kind of make a broad set of questions for our panelists to answer. And so the first one that I'm going to put forth to our panelists is, how is the lack of fire one of the greatest threats to wildlife in fire-dependent systems? And panelists, please feel free to jump on and talk freely. And for those in the audience, please ask questions within the comment or the chat function. And then there's a lot of, you all have a lot of experience with this yourself. So please feel free to share your thoughts as well. Jim, do you want to start us off?
Oh, sure. Well, in our southern pine systems, yeah, they're basically grasslands, with mature trees in the overstory. And when you remove fire, you quickly lose, there are about 40% of the species that kind of focus, the 100 bird species that nest in these areas. 40% are focused on that ground to shrub level and below. And so when you remove fire, you start to lose some of those very quickly. We have one plot here on Tall Timbers that we stopped burning in 1966. We lost 5 or 6 species within the first 4 years. And right now that plot has only 20 breeding species, whereas it had 28 breeding species when the plot was originally established. So you lose a fair portion of the biodiversity when you remove fire, especially that grass and grass nesting low bird component.
Go ahead, Susan.
Okay, I would also say that a lot of forests throughout the East are second growth or third growth forests. They're very dense. And so a lot of species, including bats, a lot of bird species are not going to be using these really dense forests. So putting fire through these forests, opening up these forests is really going to increase a lot of the biodiversity.
Yeah, I can add as well. If you look at species of conservation concern, particularly in the eastern United States and especially in the southeastern United States, a large portion of the upland species and even some of the wetland associated species are not doing well, on that list that are associated closely with fire, at least for part of their life cycle. So I think it's pretty clear evidence that fire does play an important role with a suite of species, especially ones that aren't doing very well in uplands.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and just say that one of the things I see in a lack of public knowledge about how fire helps wildlife. I think a lot of times people see a forest, and depending on what looks good to the human eye, that's a lot of times how the broader public judges a space. But we see that some of the best habitat for wildlife is often messy and really a lot of bugs, right? And very dense in certain places. And so those conditions can lead to people looking at these spaces and not necessarily seeing the value that is there for wildlife, just because those recreation needs are different for what people want when they're out in the woods versus what wildlife sometimes need, especially for breeding and thriving throughout, especially some of the tougher parts of the seasons.
On a personal basis, I'll add too that I never worry about ticks when I'm walking through a well-burned area. I worry about it all the time when I'm walking through an area that hasn't been burned.
All right, let's move on to our second question. How do you manage for pyrodiversity? And if you want to define that for yourself, you can. Please speak about what's required for decision-making, prioritization, and how do you balance trade-offs, especially when considering the needs of different species? And let's start with Paul.
Yeah, and I hope I'm not splitting hairs, or I guess when I was thinking about that, I think the way I approach it is we don't necessarily manage for pyrodiversity. We use fire diversely to manage for biodiversity. I think there's so many different ways that we can apply fire, whether it's when we do it, the scale we do it, the fire effects, the fire behavior we generate. To me, it's just varying how we apply it is how we increase our potential for allowing for or supporting a bigger range. Any fire, and there's time scales involved, but any fire has winners and losers. And so if we only do the same thing in the same place at the same time on a particular schedule, we're going to drive that system in some direction. We're going to help the winners, and we're going to really hurt the losers. And, there was an interesting example I had in a conversation just this morning with one of my colleagues. They were on a site that was burned here in Michigan in November, and I don't think they'd burned before. And one of the things I noticed in looking at the site was that clumps of big blue stem and Indian grass didn't burn. And those are the things we would normally expect, those dense herbaceous fuels to burn. And the conclusion we had in that discussion was that it may be that because it was so dense, it retained more moisture than everything else. But they probably would not have gotten that result if they were only burning in the spring, or only burning in the summer. And so to me, it's by having a broad prescription that allows you to burn in different conditions and varying when you apply fire, how you apply fire. That's how we get that's how we make biodiversity. And that's how we get our biodiversity.
I'm happy to jump in and add some complimentary thought on that. One thing in my experience, when we think about a term like biodiversity, is ironically, when I've talked to people about it, we think of it very one-dimensionally. And, really, I think it's important to consider many dimensions of diversity when you're applying fire. So that could be diversity of the size of the burn units that you're applying it to, or the timing within the year that you're applying fire, or the fire return interval. And another thing that resonated with me with what Paul was saying is I have been commonly involved in prescribed fires where we go back to areas that did not burn and intentionally try to light them on fire, and consider, that when you're trying to create a mosaic with fire, it's not only created by where you decide to put it in terms of your management units, but also by the way that fire progresses through a system. And having, particularly if you're in a situation where you're burning at particularly large scales, fire shadows that emerge within burn units can be important structure and resources for the wildlife that you're managing for, and in particular at that larger scale. So, considering those things when you are making decisions about the use of prescribed fire, I think is critical, and think about biodiversity as a multidimensional objective.
All right, let's move on to our next. Susan, did you have something to share?
Well, I was just going to say that anytime you're dealing with species, each has their own specific requirements. And so by providing that diversity across the landscape, you're providing different habitats for different species. And so talking about how fire affects birds, well, it's going to affect each species differently, same with bats, whatever. So the diversity there is probably going to help at a community scale.
All right, so let's talk about burning around sensitive species, burning around them and also for them. And so, for example, Indiana brown bat, Blanding's turtles, but there's also other species out there that we're concerned about when we burn. How do we balance those refugia needs with prescribed fire and restoration goals? So Susan, I don't know if you want to start.
Sure. And there was a question in the chat I saw, which I haven't had a chance to answer. And there's a lot of concern about Indiana bats, northern long-eared bats, tricolored bats, little brown bats, basically all species. And what we have found in general is that prescribed fire improves habitat for bats, both roosting habitat and foraging habitat. Some species prefer, say, lower intensity prescribed fires. Some species prefer the higher intensity. So again, going back to that biodiversity. Where we may come into some issues as more and more species are listed is when we can put fire on the landscape. So putting fire on the landscape during bats' maternity season, particularly with these endangered species, is probably not going to be allowed. And so it's where you put it and when you put it. But I think in general, we know that fire is important for their long-term persistence. And it's just going to be a matter of working around some of those critical time periods and those critical habitats like hybridacula and maternity roosts.
I just say for some of the species that I'm working with, the ignition patterns can be a very important parameter to pay attention to. A lot of these animals, they can't handle convergent flame links coming at them from every direction. And so having special ignition patterns that allow the animals to move away from the fire is a very important consideration too. Ring fires, for example, can be very detrimental to a lot of the species.
Yeah, the other thing I want to encourage folks is to recognize that because something is listed does not mean there's not a blanket statement saying you no longer can burn. I hope that most of the managers, at least, that are with us today, know what species they've got on the lands they manage. And hopefully they've got some background on what, the habitat requirements are and what the conservation plans for any of their particular species suggest or dictate. And generally, I think it's more of a suggestion. But the important thing, I think, is not to assume anything in terms of yes or no. I work in an office where an ES office where that's what a lot of the folks are doing, is making those plans. And the answer is call them and ask them, what can I do? What are the guidelines? What do you suggest? What are the limitations? Remember, these folks are biologists. They're not lawmakers. And so they understand that we do have habitat needs, but there's risks, but there's also benefits in fire, and that we need to maintain habitat. And to the degree possible, they want that too. But there may be some specifics, like Susan pointed out, with maternity colonies for bats. And so don't assume, make the call, figure out, is it a state level listing? So contact the DNR or, whoever handles wildlife at the state. If it's federal, again, go to the Fish and Wildlife website and look up that species, and you can find information. It might take a little bit of looking or a few phone calls to get you where you need to be, but take the time to find out what the guidance is for those particular species.
All right, Mark has put a little bit of information about fire and ticks. So I have a question about that. What is the effect of burning on invertebrate communities, and include management considerations for pest species such as ticks or acorn weevils, or also important pollinating insects? So Marcus, if you want to start us off.
Sure, I can speak to that from a couple of points of view. I've been involved in a few studies now. One, I had a discussion with one of the scientists involved that I posted that link there, and it's research that's in review currently. So it's not, I don't have a link to the actual paper yet, but one of the concerns with ticks, particularly in the northern eastern United States, but across the east, is pathogens associated with ticks. And there's been a lot of discussion over what is increasing the prevalence of some of those human important pathogens, and then also alpha-gal, which is the red meat allergy. So I've worked quite a bit with white-tailed deer and fire, and those are two of the things that get fingers pointed at them, so to speak. So there's if you look at recommendations, it very commonly includes either eliminating or dramatically reducing deer abundance. And the other one that's more recently come to be, there was a group, I think it was led out of Penn State, that had a great article on this, talking about the transition of upland hardwood forest to more mesic conditions that are better habitat for ticks. So we did a replicated experiment across 14 sites where we had multiple times of fire. We had March fire, which is typical prescribed burning season. And we had a June treatment as well, which is more typical of lightning season, at least in that area. And we were comparing that with and without excluding deer from the areas, and did it over multiple years. And it was pretty interesting. One, the exclusion of deer had no impact whatsoever on tick abundance. And that was kind of shocking to me, especially given how prevalent that messaging is in the literature. And it's actually consistent now with some other work that is emerging, trying to associate tick abundance with deer abundance. It does not correlate very strongly in many areas. And the other thing that was really interesting is that fire did not matter when it was in March, but when it was in June, it dramatically reduced tick abundance, and they did not recover for the entire return interval. And we did some follow-up work where we manipulated the environment, basically the leaf litter, to increase the amount of mesophytic litter, so that moisture holding litter that doesn't burn well from a suite of species that are invading. And as we increased that, the tick abundance increased, and fire did not change that. So the other side of that coin is the mesification and closing of the canopy in those systems also makes it less flammable during the growing season, when if we were going to try to mimic more of a lightning season fire. So a lot of things going on there, but the work from various authors across the U.S. has varied in the role of fire, and some of it might be because of that timing, I think. But the context of the fire use is really important. And the pine savannas, I think there was a great paper from the Jones Center on this that showed a pretty strong effect of frequent fire on tick abundance, especially when you're in a landscape where fire is frequent across the uplands. So I think that's a pretty nuanced discussion to have.
Anyone have thoughts to share on pollinating insects? We had a few questions about pollinators.
Yeah, I'll try to offer some thoughts. And one of the, it's so wonderful that people are thinking about that, and that's become such a, so many people are aware of it. The challenge is that the term pollinators covers an enormous range of taxa and species. And so trying to develop any kind of guidelines or suggestions to address positives or negatives for such a large range of species is really challenging. Even if we narrow down to something like bees, which is something I've got personal experience with, we've got stem nesters and we've got below ground nesters. And so our ground nesters are probably mostly immune to fire. So in terms of direct mortality, whereas our stem nesters are probably at risk, more at risk depending on the stems. But then we have to think about post-fire, indirect mortality. How large is, what was the scale? What is the foraging range for these species? If it's a small scale, a 5-acre burn, then maybe it's fairly easy for recolonization, or for those, that are emerging young bees to get out and forage and find adequate pollen and nectar. But if on a really large scale we get a big black burn, clean black, then that's becomes more challenging. So that's my first it depends answer. It really is very species dependent. And so in my mind, you really have to start to think about what is your objective for the burn. I think it always comes down to what is your objective, what do you want to accomplish? And so if it's pollinators, then is it a specific pollinator? Is it invertebrates, and which ones? And then so it gets tough, and there isn't a simple answer other than try to diversify. And that's, yeah, it's easy to say, harder to do, but that's really probably the best thing I can offer.
All right, let's talk a little bit about scale. So it's been mentioned a few times. So how big is too big? How small is too small? And then contrast the benefits and costs of landscape burning versus small patch burns. Additionally, we had questions on burning in relatively unfragmented landscapes versus small, like urban natural areas. And so can you contrast positives and benefits for both approaches as it regards to wildlife species?
I'm happy to jump in first. Some of you, if you search for bow range burning, that's one thing that I did on this. I get this question so frequently, especially from folks that are interested in game species. And we did an experiment where we were trying to figure out how small of a burn unit could we get to where we did not see a wildlife response to it. And we burned all the way down in that study to 1/4 of an acre. And we were still seeing a response from wildlife. And that told me one thing, that it was pretty interesting. Yeah.
Positive response or negative response?
Yes, good point. We saw what we'd call a magnet effect. And that essentially the wildlife species were really attracted to the small burned area, even when it was that small. So positive response. Now, you would not, in most cases, be managing at that scale to try to improve habitat quality for most species. But it told me that a lot of wildlife species are so linked to fire that, they still respond to it even when it's really small acreage. Another thing that I have been involved in a lot of work and thought about this quite a bit is a lot of the other issues of concern are inextricably linked to scale. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of concern over burning, for instance, this discussion earlier, burning during sensitive times for wildlife. Well, that inherently is also a spatial scale dependent issue. And, you know, if you're in a situation, I usually get this commentary from folks that are interested in turkeys or quail, but I think it applies to a variety of other species that might have a sensitive time. If you're in a situation where you're burning at particularly large scales relative to that species, that sensitive time is more of a concern. The other issue with something like turkeys, we commonly are targeting an area that is already unusable or is quickly moving into an unusable state. So in that circumstance, particularly if we start scaling down the operation during a sensitive time like nesting, and couple that with the fact that the reason we're re-entering the stand is because it is moved in succession to a state that's not usable anymore, I become much less concerned about using fire during that sensitive time. And I think that's an important part of the spatial scale role, is that many species might respond to different scales and need different scales. That's one way to increase biodiversity. And the scale is certainly integrated into your decision making on, you know, burning for species during sensitive times for that particular species.
One thing that I always kind of get worried about when we talk about scale a lot is because we're not meeting our burn goals on most of the public lands that I know of in the state of Florida. And the time it takes to burn several small units versus one large unit is a big consideration. And I just recommend that land managers out there at least test out the small scale issues in units that are close to their equipment barn. So they're not driving, 100 miles to do a 5-acre burn, but they, driving short distances to conduct their small scale burns nearby.
I'm glad Marcus used the phrase, the reason they're burning. Really that comes down, that's so important for so many of the questions we're going to talk about. What is your objective? What do you want to see happen on the landscape? Why? What do you think fire is going to do for you? What do you intend fire to do for you? I mean, that's going to drive a lot of your decisions, and scale is certainly one of those. And so to me, it always comes back to objectives. And then if you have that objective, then you can begin to answer some of those questions, especially if you can make it a measurable objective. And it can be kind of tough to turn those things into numbers. And I struggle with that as much as anybody does. But if it's measurable, then you can go back and say how you did, and then you can make adjustments. But having that objective and being able to state, this is why I'm doing it, to me, that's scale. Like so many other questions, that's probably the most fundamental thing we need to think about, is why we're out there and what do we want to accomplish.
And I think when we talk about effects, we have to, are we talking about short-term effects or long-term effects? And so the scale in terms of a short-term effect is going to depend on the movement ability of your species. Can they escape whatever? And then also the recolonization ability to the area. And then, but on a long-term scale, that's, you may want those larger birds because they are going to have a greater, oftentimes positive effect at the larger scale. So again, you can't really separate time and space.
Yeah, I wanted to add one more thing that I think links to several. On public land, we often are in a situation where we have to become more and more efficient. And that needs to be considered practically, because we have large amounts of acreage and that, limited staff and resources. And that is a major concern for a lot of you probably. But some of you may be landowners or work with private landowners like I do, and scale also is a barrier, especially for people that are less familiar with the use of fire, and it seems more of a daunting task to burn at large scales. And when I say large for a private landowner, I mean like more than 50 acres at a time. And that's something that I've worked quite a bit on in the private realm, especially in the Southeast, where, a large portion of our landscape is privately owned. And I've actually seen a much wider adoption of fire and the use of fire to meet management objectives when you start to show that you can have positive impacts on your objectives at smaller scales. I think even that, that point of view is important, that, what is the context that you're using fire in and what are the barriers? That has to be considered. And I commonly am thinking about it completely opposing in terms of whether you're scaling up or scaling down, depending on those, that, whether it's public or private land. Just that one factor, I think, makes a big difference.
Marcus or anybody else can take this, but I'm just curious. I've had questions in the past about how much time you need to plan these sorts of things. So we've been talking a bit about private landowners, and sometimes folks don't know how far in advance you need to start asking these questions and looking at things prior to a burn. So I'm just curious if someone could speak on that.
Yeah, well, again, it depends, but it probably depends on, I think the things I would offhand that I would offer would be, experience, skill level, resources available. If you are coming at it completely, you private landowner, for example, you acquire some property you want to burn, I think you have to take a long range view because there's going to be a lot of learning involved. You've got to learn, learn about the landscape. You've got to learn about, the species that use it. You need to learn about how to apply fire, how to do it safely, probably make relationships. You're going to probably need help. So I think I'd say be patient and think long term. I mean, nature works long term, so I think that's is in our favor generally, except maybe some invasive species don't always think long term. They're pretty quick. I wish I could give you a number on that, but I would be thinking in terms of years with respect probably to someone coming in new as a private landowner. If it's an established organization and you have the ability, you've got a team, and you're just going to something, a new unit or a new piece of land, then it can happen pretty quickly probably. But I'm assuming that question probably comes for people who are not don't have the familiarity or coming in new. So I would probably put it in terms of years.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That's part of the point, right? Is to build some expectations around how long it takes to prepare for doing these kinds of things, and to consult with folks like you, right? Because there are a lot of different questions that need to be asked prior to making a plan. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about scale. Let's dive a little bit into seasonality, and then maybe we'll move into how we can use fire and the way we apply fire to sort of address different sort of concerns. And so the question on seasonality is, what's the current state of knowledge on the risks and benefits for burning during the active or growing season? And include some of the timing considerations. Folks were interested in species such as ground and grassland nesting birds, but also game species such as turkey and deer. And Marcus has talked a little bit about this, but Jim, let's start off with you with the birds.
Well, for a lot of the species I work with, ground nesting birds, a lot of times when you set a fire, you let the fuels build up to a point that they're going to carry through the unit successfully. At that point, oftentimes the ground level conditions are kind of clogged up for a lot of ground nesting birds. One of the species I work with, Bachman sparrows, for example, in our area, they start to leave an area 12 to 18 months after the most recent fire and start to find new places that have been burned. So these birds are moving over the landscape looking for these areas. So for some species, it's not a big concern. For others, of course it is. And particularly for some of the herps and amphibians in our region too, the season is very important. The species that use ephemeral wetlands the season is very important because the wetlands are filled up, during portions of the year. And if you're burning them, you're not getting the fire into those wetland areas where they can clear out the shrubs and replace the shrubs with grasses. So that's a very important consideration there. I know some fire managers who actually will burn a unit when they can, and then they'll come along behind afterwards and try to get those wetlands when things are extremely droughty, so they can burn them safely with everything else around it having been burned up. So it's a really site-specific issue, but it's very important, to incorporate a range of seasons and know why you're doing it, you're putting the fire in, and what effect it's going to have. Another thing about season 2 is that we did one study with quail, for example, where in the same property, burns were conducted in a very very narrow time frame. Basically, all the property was burned up in March and April. The following year, they burned the property in March, April, May, and June. And by extending those units out into May and June, when you were burning those May and June units, actually the March area had already recovered, so you didn't have as much black on the ground there too. So by extending your time frame out over a larger area, you can actually have more sort of areas that the species can use. This survivorship of the female quails on the area which was been burned over a longer period of time was about 50% higher than it was on the area that had all been blackened out within just a few months in early spring.
Yeah, I can jump in and add some commentary here. I've worked extensively with wild turkeys on this issue and with white-tailed deer. That's driving a large amount of the land holding, the decision making, especially with use of fire in this part of the world. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the major concerns with turkeys that people really focus on is burning during nesting. And, I mentioned earlier, I think that's a scale dependent issue, and similar to what Jim's talking about, we're often targeting areas where they're not usable for nesting anyway, or at least not highly desirable structure for nesting in. So that reduces my concern there. But to give you a little additional context, when I go across the landscape on many properties, public and private, across quite a large portion of the eastern United States, the thing that I see that is limiting to turkeys is usually not nesting, and it would overwhelmingly be brood rearing cover. And that, I think, is another consideration to have, is what is limiting the species that you're trying to target with fire. And, while we might consider burning during nesting a problem for nesting for that species, it may actually make that space usable, and in the case of turkeys, high quality brooding cover, not that long after that fire occurs. And that actually may have a net positive effect on the species. And I think in many cases with turkeys, it does, because brood rearing cover is so limited across the landscape, at least. And I think that's, something that should be considered when you're thinking about the timing and using growing season fire, is thinking about the biology of the species and what are you actually missing. With deer, I see a lot of opportunity as well, where you're using fire to maintain a plant community structure and composition that's desirable for a variety of parts of the biology of that species, and particularly moving the fire timing into the growing season. I've published a few papers now showing this very clearly. The plants that are resprouting following fire, those plants are extremely high quality. And to meet the requirements of peak lactation or peak antler growth for deer, that nutrient pulse following fire could be really important, especially if you're in really poor soil productivity regions. And I think that is another thing that you can find some real value in expanding the burn window such that you take advantage of things like that resource pulse and try to coincide that with peak nutrient demand of the species. And you get the added advantage that you lengthen the burn window, which relaxes limitations on resources and time and all those other things that we've been talking about. So I think that's definitely an important part of this discussion. And at least with those two species, I've seen a lot of benefit from expanding the burn window into those growing season months.
Yeah, the one thing I would add, and I'm going to give a shout out to the Fueling Collaboration crew, because this is a realization I had listening to a previous Fueling Collaboration talking about this, and I'm almost embarrassed to say it hadn't occurred to me before, but when we burn in the dormant season, everything is in the same phenological state. Whereas if we move into the growing season, we hit lots of different phenological states. There'll be some that are have already matured. You've got some that are just coming on, some that are flowering, and so you create diversity. So we talk about biodiversity and biodiversity. You have a diversity of effects, or greater diversity effects on at least on the plant community, and then of course downstream on the animal community as well. But that was, it seems obvious now, but it was something that hadn't really clicked to me before. To me, that's an important part of the biodiversity and the biodiversity. Is thinking about the diverse phenological range within those plant animal communities.
As I mentioned before, there is concern about burning during bat breeding periods, particularly for the endangered species. But also in terms of the studies that have been done, it's a lot of, there's a lot of variation in terms of responses to season of burn. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the effectiveness of the burn. So sometimes burns are put in and maybe not be that effective, so there's really not much of a response, positive or negative. Whereas other times you're seeing more of a response. So it may not necessarily be, well, probably it is tied to season. So I think it's a matter of how we can be most effective in terms of meeting our habitat management goals, as Paul has mentioned.
And Susan, can you define effective, a burn that's effective? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think to a large extent, when we're talking about bats, we're talking about something that is actually reducing the amount of clutter, that is maybe creating a few openings, that is creating better roosting habitat. A lot of bats will prefer roosts that are, say, on the edge, that are getting more solar radiation. So basically something that is opening up the canopy and opening up that mid-story.
At the risk of pointing any fingers at the research community, because I certainly do not mean to do so, but I think historically, there hasn't been a good emphasis on documenting the burn itself, environmental conditions, fire behavior. And so I think we're getting better at that and recognizing that every burn is not the same. And so I think that's an important part of that research. And certainly what Susan's pointing at, an effective burn depends on our fire effects, which depends on our fire behavior and a number of things. And so, again, I think we need to think about all those things, and we need to look for that information. It's, burning is not burning is not burning, so it's a matter of not just did we burn, but what happened when we burned immediately and long term, not short term, first order, but second order beyond fire effects too. So it's not just burning, it's how do we do, what did it look like?
What a great transition into fire implementation. So let's talk a little bit, and I think Jim brought this up, but maybe a ring fire is not the best for protecting wildlife, but what guidance can you give about providing refugia for wildlife species of all different taxa? And one question that I remember from what was sent in, talking about urban sort of small patches, and maybe we are able to provide more refugia in a large landscape. What if you do only have 20 acres for a species and you don't want to burn up all your amphibians? So let's talk a little bit about implementation.
Okay, I'll give it a try. Yeah, again, I'm going to go back to objective. What is it you want to achieve with that burn? That's, to me, that's the first thing always. But that's well, let's define refugia too. How about that? I think it's easy to think of refugia as, we burn this piece, we're going to leave that piece unburned. So we have before and after and two completely different conditions. But it's also what happens within the unit. I think it was Marcus earlier talking about the mosaic of a burn, and we, that was part of my example earlier from this November burn. I think by not those bunch grasses not burning, there's probably insect refugia within those units. So I would encourage us to think broadly about how we define refugia, and think about ways to not just size, and size is very species dependent. Again, it has to do with, and then get foraging range for insects, but home range for deer and grassland birds, and these are all, each of the taxa, each of the species are going to have a slightly different need there, and so that's where again it comes back to objective. And I already lose my train of thought, so I better just stop right there.
So I'll jump in here really quick, just on the implementation front. So a lot of folks have these questions, right, about how this is impacting wildlife. And when you have a fire, maybe in a more urban area or proximate to an urban area, you do get more people interested in wanting to understand this as well. So I just wanted to say that these kinds of webinars are so great because you can see all the resources that are showing up in the chat, and the folks that you can connect to, so that when people have questions, folks who aren't involved in the fire, you can have resources to hand off to them and help them understand and provide. That can often be a great gateway for folks who don't have property or maybe aren't directly involved in the management of wildlife, to introduce them to some of these concepts and bring them in, because these kinds of conversations are really important for folks who are actually doing the work. But everybody votes, and so we have to keep that in mind as well when it comes to what's allowed on the landscape, the perceptions of the folks who are near that. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think with implementation, it's easy to get focused on the wildlife themselves and the impacts because that's what you need as a manager. But the other piece of that is there are a lot of places where that implementation in and of itself is being prevented because of objections from potentially folks who don't understand the benefits of wildlife and what's happening.
So this is brought up a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the recovery of wildlife to fire, and then how does that relate to fire frequency? And so how do wildlife populations recover following fire? And then how does the frequency of fire further influence their recovery?
Well, in our setting here, they recover really quickly. We're burning on fairly small scales, and these species are adapted to it. What I'm worried about in Florida is some of our systems now that are, basically circumscribed by urban development. And we have this one community in particular, our scrub communities, which require high intensity fire to recreate the conditions that for a lot of the species need. It's very difficult to implement that. I saw a question about intensity here. We do have a really high intensity system in Florida that is very difficult to manage right now. And it's basically in a lot of areas boiling down to mechanical treatments of those areas, unfortunately, rather than fire. I hope that someday we can get some burning of those areas, but it's going to be a very difficult problem here in Florida for us. And the other recovery stuff, I mean, it's in large landscapes where I'm working with, it happens almost instantaneously. We'll have male bobbing sparrows singing on the property area that just burned, 2 weeks earlier, fly in. So it's recovery is really, really quick in some of the areas where we have these high frequency fire return intervals.
Yeah, I can add to that. Jim and I think complement one another. We work with different segments of the communities, and in my work, same in the landscapes that we're applying frequent prescribed fire at relatively small scales. Essentially, every species we track, we call it a magnet effect, where they're actually intensively attracted right after fire, sometimes the same day or even within a couple of days. And then herbivores, we see that delayed a couple of weeks longer, but a lot of them are using it to find dead insects or seeds or things like that. And then, once the vegetation is responding, we see things responding to it to brood in or to nest in, which Jim is much more keen to talk about. However, I did see some things in the chat. I think that is important to talk about that context, because that is substantially different than what you would expect in a really large scale stand replacing wildfire context, which we've experienced in other parts of the world. Is not as common here in our part of the world, and that's not the role that I usually am playing when I'm talking about fire. But that is quite a different circumstance in that, in those systems.
One of the sort of interesting post-fire things that I see too that sort of has me interested is a lot of the species that forage up in the canopy are suddenly down on the ground. Things like pine warblers and stuff, and they're picking through the char. There's a release of calcium, from all these shrubs and stuff, and these birds are actually down there picking the char, possibly to get some of the calcium now has been redistributed and made available to them. So that's a recovery aspect that is kind of interesting to watch foraging behavior change in some of these species.
I think one of the things a lot of our managers are thinking about and have to think about is, we often think it sounds like, or maybe we take for granted when we talk about fire that we have a fairly intact system we're working in. But sometimes we're using fire intentionally to really move it in a different direction. We may have, been heavily invaded by some invasive species, or, just a type change over a long period of time. And so, Lauren asked earlier, well, positive or negative effects, maybe we're looking for those negative effects. Maybe we need to kill some trees. Maybe we need to remove something, in which case we want that regular, or might want a more frequent fire to kind of get it back to where we want it to be. But then there's also the question of fuel availabilities. How long do we have to wait till we get another fuel bed that we can burn again? And it depends. So it really is it's a complex question, but keeping in mind that there are positive and negatives effects, and those relate to our objectives. Maybe killing a lot of trees is a positive effect to get our stand where we want it to be. And so, I think we have to be careful when we talk about fire about, is it good or bad, or positive or negative, because it's some people see it as a disturbance, as part of the landscape, and sometimes we think about it as a tool. And so it's, what do we want to get out of a particular burn, or what do we want to happen in a system? And so timing is dependent.
So I think that brings us to end a question from Luke currently in the chat to another question that I have for you all. Please explain how what is natural is not always good for wildlife communities when they are no longer as they were. How do we manage ecological communities with restoring prescribed fire? when they have deviated so far from their historical range of variation? Marcus, I'm gonna ask you this one first.
Yeah, I certainly deal with this quite a bit most of the time in the Southeast, but I think it's important for us to realize that, the evolution of these species and the systems that they are in and understand that fully. But we also need to recognize mimicking nature may not even be an option. And what I mean by that is, we're talking a lot about the context of dependence of responses of the system or fire effects on the system, depending on timing or frequency. But we have a large portion of the landscape where fire is not an accessible tool for one reason or another. If you're in the Northeast, it may not even be legal. You have other situations where the encroachment from development and everything does not make it a possibility, and you may not have that as an option in that context. The other one that I've worked with quite a bit in the Southern Appalachians, a lot of the stands are in conditions where you couldn't burn during the summer months because you can't pull a permit on days that it will actually burn on. So, there are lots of things that have changed in the landscape that have changed the way we need to think about this issue and how accessible the tool is for mimicking nature. That being said, a lot of our species do not perform well if we don't have something mimicking that type of disturbance. And, I often think about it more of from the point of view that having fire is important, and you may not be able to use it exactly in line with the way that you think nature used it historically, but we still see a net benefit on quite a few species, even if the season is mismatched or the scale or the temporal frequency. We still often see net positive on these disturbance associated species. And I think that's important for us to think about. And, if you can mimic nature, that's great. But, considering the net benefits of fire, I think is more important often.
In terms of mimicking Mother Nature too, we've got to realize that we're managing a lot of rare species on a small fraction of the former landscape that they once occupied. There are classic cases in Central Florida for the fire management for one of our grassland, a grasshopper sparrow that's endemic to Florida, may have been going in the wrong direction and be contributing to the declines of the birds. There's a big move to shift over into burning during the growing season, which is also the nesting season down there for this species in the early 1990s. And that's when a lot of the population started to tank. And more recent studies have shown the best time to burn for that bird is not during the lighting season, but very early in the year. It provides a sparrow with many more opportunities for breeding than you have if you try to burn as Mother Nature did in that area. So it's another consideration, particularly with rare species.
All right, so we've had a great discussion about the benefits of fire and some of the things to think about. And we have some great communicators on this panel. So how do we best communicate the benefits of fire with considering the risks for wildlife species or populations? And some of the questions that we received were even things like, how do I get my wildlife biologists to be interested in burning? And so even within the wildlife community, there's folks that have different willingness to burn. So how do we get the message out? And Ashley, I'm going to start with you.
It's a very complex question, right? I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, working with foresters and biologists to come up with answers to these questions. And unfortunately, it's the same as just about anything else in science. And it depends on who you're talking to and what the situation is, right? But a couple things I'll highlight is that, I think we often think of social media as spreading misinformation, which it certainly can. But there are a few accounts online that really do a great job of helping to educate people on the benefits. So I'll just call out Kyle Leiberger, who's in Alabama and has Native Plant Talk. So on TikTok, he provides these kind of bite-sized pieces of information about burning on a landscape and what the considerations are and how it can help wildlife. And so I think, a lot of times this can be a lot of new information for folks, and that can be overwhelming. So as much as possible, providing bite-sized information over time to a broader audience so that you do have just in general folks more understanding and willing to be part of those conversations. But something that like the Rough Grass Society does regularly, we'll do woods walks and go through properties that have already been burned to showcase the benefits and what that looks like, not just right after the burn, right, but years down the road, and how that grows into really a thriving paradise in a lot of cases for wildlife, and being able to see the various phases. So a lot of times in communications, we'll consider that, when you see a burn on the landscape or somebody sees that, that's halfway through the story. You're not seeing the full story arc of what happens, when you plan that burn and how that results in benefits for wildlife. So really just honestly, experiential pieces are always the best. If you can get people on the ground in the woods, especially in the spring when you can hear the biodiversity, you can hear those birds in the woods, you can hear the ruffed grouse drumming, you can see the American woodcock, right, flying over these various parts of diverse forests. Those are often the best ways to really help folks understand the benefits for wildlife through fire. But I'd love to hear from some other folks, because I know you all work directly with landowners.
Well, one of the things I think is important is reducing the dimensionality of the problem and making something simple. So for example, in our southern pinelands, the two species of birds that best predict avian species richness are Bachman sparrows and red-cockaded woodpeckers. Most biologists working on managed areas know a lot about red-cockaded woodpeckers, but we recently devised some very simple monitoring procedures they can use for the sparrows as well. And so you can have them out there doing these playback surveys, and they start to question, well, I didn't get a sparrow here this year for some reason. I had it here last year. And they start relating the sparrows' distribution with the fires and how they're burning the areas. And so sometimes those sort of simple things, getting them to talk about the organisms and paying attention to a few of them, that is a good way to make managers more aware of what's happening out there. And the public too, general public.
There's some really great tools. I mean, I'm sure most folks who are listening to this are aware of eBird, but it's a pretty simple citizen science tool that has been used to highlight what birds are where and where can you go to see them, and things like that. You can tap into that as a resource to showcase species diversity.
I want to thank Ashley for setting the example. And she just said, I'd like to hear from you. And I think we are pretty quick to say, I want to teach you. I want to tell you. We need to convince them. And I think, thank you for saying it. And thank you for putting it in those terms, is that, I think the first thing we need to do is pause and listen. And I think that probably opens their ears more than anything, I'm guessing. And that's something Ashley can help us understand better. But I think that's a great point. Is maybe we need to slow down, try a little less hard to convince them. But they got to know, they need to know that burning is the most important thing. Maybe, but, or how we go about that is probably pretty important. And but that's the listening, I think, is a pretty huge part of that.
Yeah, I can add another dimension to that same kind of idea. I've gotten really active in social media and various technologies trying to communicate, especially about fire, but just wildlife management in general. And I've learned a lot from that, but I have done that for a variety of reasons, one of which I see a lot of misinformation there, and I don't see a lot of representation from the scientific community in some of those spaces. And I felt like I could fill that niche well. But also one thing I've learned from being involved in all these different efforts, the podcasting, the social media, going and working with private landowners extensively in various formats, I realized really quickly that we shouldn't necessarily be telling them what they should care about. I've taken more of an approach to figure out what do they care about and how can fire help them. And then I will realize some of the objectives that I have more broadly for wildlife diversity, for instance. And, in this part of the world, a lot of landowners, they care about having big deer and a lot of turkeys gobbling. I'm not going to change that. So how can fire help them have bigger deer and more turkeys gobbling? And that will lead to implementation. And what are the barriers that they have to implementing it once they realize that there's value? And that's been the approach, and why all of my outreach, everything that people see going out from my program is focused on that, because it's so commonly driving the interests of that base, of people who are influencing the resource. And one thing I've learned from that is once they get into using fire in many of these situations, not only do they realize some benefits for their initial objective, which is one of those game species, but then they start to appreciate the wide diversity of flowering plants that they didn't realize they didn't have, or the beautiful pollinators, or the elaborate colorations of breeding birds that are associated with them. They didn't even realize they didn't have it or that they wanted it until they saw that response. And I think that's really important, that we're not trying to change them what they should care about. Maybe think about what do they care about and how can we use fire and develop information to help them with that goal. And then they often expand their objectives in experiencing those responses.
Susan, you've dealt with
Yeah.
some pretty charismatic, sensitive species. I'm sure you've had to deal with this topic with others.
Well, our unit does a lot in terms of field tours, and I do a lot in terms of webinars, and showing graphs and figures is effective, depending on the audience. But I think getting people out, as Ashley mentioned, and seeing what a burn looks like, and then talking about how animals respond is really the best way. And it's also how that's where I get my better questions. People are out there, they're looking around, and so then they start thinking about things in a different way. And so I know it's a lot, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort on both parts, but I think social media is great for maybe getting people a small taste, but I think getting people out there and looking, and maybe we just need to do a better job of getting some demonstration areas out there, and to show what a fire is, and that it does have oftentimes mostly positive effects.
So I'm going to end with one last curated question for you all. And so I'm going to ask you to speculate, based on your knowledge, how will global change impact our ability to use prescribed fire and its influence on wildlife species? And so Marcus talked a little bit about the influence of people and the lack of the ability to use fire, but then you could also think about climate change. So Jim, let's start with you. What do you think the future holds for fire and wildlife?
It's scary. No other way to describe it. I mean, I'm really concerned about the Shrubs love CO2. The grasses that we have here, they developed under low CO2 climates historically. And what we're moving to is more CO2, more shrubs. The conditions for burning the windows available for burning are probably going to collapse as the temperatures continue to rise. And it's going to be problematic. I can't see the very far in the future how bad it's going to be, but I'm really worried about the future use of fire in the Southeast in particular.
Paul, what are your thoughts on in your region and where you work?
I have to admit, I'm a little more now focused. Those are such big questions that they're a little overwhelming for me individually, and so I don't think a lot about it. I hear a lot about climate change, and I'm glad people mentioned populations. I guess the one thing I would have is that, especially with respect to using fire, is, and I'm just seeing some stuff in the chat about monitoring, and I guess it's a little bit of a deviation, but if we're going to continue to use fire, we need to have some way to objectively evaluate our success and in meeting those objectives, and I think we have. So again, we have to have objectives. We have to see how we're doing. So things are changing. Things have changed in the last several hundred years. Things have never been stable, right? There is no static in nature, so it's always changing. And so we have to continually evaluate if fire is doing what we think it's doing. And it's going to change. It'll keep changing. The rate of change might be accelerating. What direction? I don't know. But I just encourage everyone to continue, if you tend to continue to use fire, to continue to assess how it's working for you.
Monitoring is important. Marcus, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with the others. This is a really challenging topic to address, and I think if it was just climate change, it'd be easier to address, but it really is global change, and that comes in many forms. And depending on where you're at, you may be dealing with sensitive areas associated with humans. You may be in systems where you have new plant species on the block, so to speak, that are dramatically influencing flammability or fire behavior or the applicability of that practice. And it's really I'm kind of in the same thought process. It's only going to become more and more difficult for us to navigate all the suite of issues, and it's all the more important to have these kinds of discussions and try to continue to build our knowledge base and understanding of how to navigate this really complex socio-ecological problem. We think we need to focus on that and try to maintain fire and meet objectives as best we can, but I think it's going to become more and more challenging to do so.
Ashley, what are your thoughts?
I guess, my reaction to that question about, climate change in the future is just, if the goal is biodiversity, if we're talking about this in that context, we have to see fire as one tool in a larger toolbox, right? So, considering grazing and timber harvests and other options for creating diversity, when you've got big challenges where there might be less days in a particularly dry year where it's safe for you to burn. So I think to everything everyone has already said, kind of the hopeful message is there are a suite of tools and options that we can look into and consider. We're just going to have to stay pretty open about what those options need to be depending on the conditions and where things are.
And Susan, your thoughts?
Okay, I will keep this very brief. Yeah, I'm quite concerned. Just the ability to find a number of enough days to do the burns that we need to do. Also considering from the animals' perspective in terms of changes in their phenology and how we then mesh the burning with those types of changes. But I think we just need to continue to figure out how to get fire on the landscape where it is needed, and how it can be effective to maintain these species.
Now, it looks like there's quite a bit of interest in how to develop monitoring for both, fire and wildlife. And so perhaps that's another conversation in the future, because it can be very habitat and species dependent of what you're looking at. But certainly, as we're talking about climate change and global change, monitoring how things are changing is going to be ever more important. So we have 3 minutes left. Is there any parting thoughts before we close out the panel? Do you guys have anything you want to say about, what brings you joy when you go to sleep at night regarding wildlife and fire, as we ended the topic on kind of a negative point?
Well, I just enjoy listening to the birds. About 6 months after fire has taken place, it's a very rewarding experience to be out there and have 35, 40 species shouting out, "Get your good genes right here." And so please take people out and let them enjoy the post-fire experience that the birds and a lot of other organisms provide.
I can echo that. I really enjoy seeing wildlife respond to fire, and it's often melodic and elaborate coloration wise, and it's just a real joy to watch.
All right, Jen, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close us out.
Yeah, that was a great final question. That's just been leaving me smiling. And what an incredible panel. I think y'all have provided such amazing context for the topic that we're talking about today. Just to close out, Craig put the link for our survey into the chat. Please take a minute. It's really, really quick to just give us some feedback. We really appreciate it. Again, we're not using any identifying information, and it'll be shared with just the partners that are planning this. If you are seeking CEUs, hopefully you got my message and changed your name in the participant list, so we can do that. If not, just send us your name as it was in the participant list so we can verify that you're here. And other than that, I just want to say thank you to all of our planning partners and to Lauren for stepping in as moderator and all of our incredible panelists. Thank you all so much. And we'll see you at the next one.